When I talk in academic and scientific circles about mystical experience, I have to be very careful of my terminology. And so I alter the phrase mystical experience and call it ecological awareness, because it really amounts to the same thing. But the terminology is much more acceptable in a scholarly environment, because, after all, mysticism is a dirty word, associated with mist and vagueness. On the other hand, there is this difficulty, that in our universities today, ecology has not quite come of age as a science, although its importance is vastly recognized. Ecology, being the science which studies the relationship between organisms and their environments, is a multidisciplinary science. And therefore, its existence on any campus today runs afoul of departmental politics. You notice, you see, that all our universities are based on the idea that there are departments of knowledge. And if you trace the history of universities over several centuries, you will see that the classification of departments keeps changing. There was a time in the Middle Ages when, for example, theology was the queen of the sciences, therefore had high rank as a department, as today the Department of Physics or Chemistry would have. But now it has almost completely disappeared. There is a department, yes, maybe of the history of religions, which occupies an obscure set of rooms in the philosophy building or something like that, which is way off at the edge of the campus. But you cannot keep these departments fixed, because as between, say, biology and physics, we develop a science of biophysics. As between biology and chemistry, we develop a science of biochemistry. As between physics and mathematics, we get mathematical physics. As between physics and astronomy, we get astrophysics. And the formations keep changing, and this has very difficult political consequences, for the simple reason that the faculty members and chairmen of departments are jealous of their positions. And they're always apt to say, when these new hybrid departments start out, that these people are dabblers. In other words, they should get a thorough grounding in biology, zoology, botany, bacteriology, and all those separate departments before they should dare venture into such a thing as ecology, which involves all those different sciences and more. What is not generally understood, however, is a most peculiar thing and very difficult to explain. In the academic world, you know how students have to go through prerequisite courses. They're supposed to take this before they take that. Well, it's being found out increasingly that this is completely unnecessary. That for some reason, as time goes on, students develop the ability to absorb bodies of knowledge for which it was thought they had no prerequisites. In the same way as let's say, in the childhood of anybody now aged roughly 50, it was very difficult to understand Einstein's theory of relativity, and you always had to have a demonstration on a blackboard and all sorts of diagrams. But now young people get this idea instantly. They have no difficulty in absorbing it any more than we had difficulty in absorbing the notion that the Earth was spherical. We were no longer embarrassed. Our common sense was no longer offended by the thought that people living in the Antipodes would be hanging upside down. In this sort of way, common sense, a feeling for knowledge, adjusts itself. And more it becomes obvious that there have to be ways of linking together the departments of knowledge. It's almost as if the established departments like physics, chemistry, history, anthropology, and so on, were like huge paving stones. And it's always between the paving stones that the little things begin growing. So the growing edge is in the interstices between the departments. Now, therefore, ecology becomes of absolutely primary importance in the modern world because, as so many of us have often said, Western man is equipped with technical powers such as have not been seen in known history, and is using those powers to alter his environment, but doing it in a way and in a spirit that may, instead of altering the environment, merely destroy it. What I call Los Angelization instead of civilization is taking over. And we are fouling our own nest. And therefore, I approached this whole matter because of my interest in the Chinese and Japanese philosophy of nature, wherein there is not this sense of hostility between the human organism and its environment, but rather a sense of being one with it and collaborating with it. And thus it's been my particular interest to see in what way this Far Eastern attitude to nature, based originally on the philosophy of Taoism, is applicable in a technological civilization. Because there is one school of thought which says, of course, we've got to press technological progress as far as possible, and we therefore get a proliferation of so-called growing communities, which are very evident here in California, and remind some of us of the growth of cancer cells rather than the growth of anything of a biologically healthy nature. And this is called progress, and people say, you can't stop progress, don't be sentimental. And on the other hand, there are the people who really do want to stop this. And I find that to some considerable extent among young people who are, shall I say, digging the dropout scene, there is a very definite wish to, as it were, join the American Indians, to get rid of concrete, to go back to green grass. As Gary Snyder put it the other day, when you want to go from Sausalito to Big Sur, don't take the freeway. Don't even take the side roads. Find an old trail and walk it, because the journey will be worth taking then. And he feels, for example, that all the state park rangers should busy themselves with opening up trails so that more and more young people can walk and have stations, a day's walk apart, where they can rest for the night, or where there are congenial farmers and friendly people with homes who will accommodate them. And so we will set up, as it were, a whole network of communications and culture entirely apart from the freeways and the suburban subtopia that sprawls all over the place. Because like any good Indian, American Indian that is, they sit around waiting and watching, as they know that one of these days this whole industrial civilization is just going to disappear into gas and will leave them as they were in the beginning. You see, these are two completely extreme points of view. And I want to explore rather the possibility that there is a middle way, that that technology is not a purely unnatural manifestation, that it is a perfectly proper development of human capacities, but that it has to be used in the right spirit and with the right care, in such a way that we do not disturb irremediably what are called the balances of nature. The idea that there are balances of nature, that no species, for example, should get so out of hand as to become top species and really dominate all the others, as human beings are trying to do, goes back, of course, to the fundamental Chinese notion of nature as the balancing of two forces called the yang and the yin. or in Japanese, in-yo. The whole of the Book of Changes, which is a very, very ancient text, fundamental to Chinese ways of thinking and to Chinese logic, is based on an analysis of the processes of nature in terms of the relative balancing of these forces. Perhaps forces is not quite the right word. It is, you see, obvious to a Taoist, to Buddhists, to Hindus, that this universe is a single system of energy. But there is no way of defining and putting your finger on that particular one energy. And even energy is not quite the right word to use, because energy indicates something in motion, and we do not know or realize motion except in relation to stillness and vice versa. So whatever energy stillness is fundamentally cannot be thought about, defined, or talked about in any way. It is basic to everything that we both experience and don't experience. It bears somewhat the same relation to our everyday life as the diaphragm in a loudspeaker bears to all the sounds that you hear on the radio. Every sound of the human voice, of all kinds of musical instruments, of airplanes, of automobiles, so on, anything you can hear on the radio is actually the vibration of a diaphragm. But the radio does not proclaim this fact. The announcer does not come on first thing in the morning and say, all the sounds that you will hear after here are vibrations of a diaphragm, including this sound, and not the actual wind in musical instruments and human vocal cords. No, because wherever any circumstance is constant, we tend in the course of time to ignore it. We rule it out of all practical politics because it is basic to everything. So as in an equation, when you get two terms that are identical on either side of the equation, you can just cancel them out. They make no difference. But in a way, this is a very difficult point because obviously it is highly important that the diaphragm be there, because otherwise there wouldn't be any voices or any music. And yet the diaphragm as such makes no difference to the distinctions between voices and musical instruments and so on. From a logical point of view, it is absolutely meaningless to talk about anything which is common to everything, which is the substratum or ground of being. But the categories of logic do not embrace all knowledge. And it is possible for human beings once again to become aware in a certain way of this substratum, not, however, as an object, not as something you can take out and look at, but nevertheless to be very strongly and almost sensuously aware of it, and in so doing regain a new sense of one's own identity, one's own being, not as one of many things, one little event among many events that are all coming and going and temporary, but a sense of one's actual self as being this single energy field, which can't be, however, defined or identified. And through realizing that, to take away the frantic anxiety that we have to secure ourselves as separate organisms and to fight with other organisms and play these elaborate games of one-upmanship, and above all, to overcome the anxiety which leads us to regard nature itself as our enemy that has to be conquered and subjugated. I shall, of course, return in later sessions to the nature of this realization but I only want to say in passing that there's a very peculiar thing about it. Namely, that the realization I'm speaking of is not something like a belief. It is not an idea, for the simple reason that the fundamental energy of the universe cannot be embraced in an idea. It cannot be embraced in a concept, in a form of words, in an explanation, because it eludes all classification, because it is the which than which there is no whicher, and therefore is not in any class. Secondly, if you try to catch hold of it and somehow possess it, you are doing what is called in Zen putting legs on a snake, because there is no need to possess it. You are it, and if you try to possess it, you imply that you're not. So by trying to catch hold of it, you, as it were, push it away, although you can't really push it away, because the very pushing is all it, you see. So there are people who are divided into two schools of thought: those who believe that by exerting their energies to get hold of it, they can achieve something, and the opposite people who think that by doing nothing at all, one achieves it. But both are wrong, because both the attempt to get it and the attempt to try not to get it are actually attempts to get it. And there is no need to. But nevertheless, by going into this, by meditation and so on, it is possible to realize that we are identical with the fundamental energy of the universe, that that is our real self, and although it doesn't make a difference, because all differences are in a way made by it, therefore it makes no difference to differences, nevertheless it's completely basic. You see, it's as if what has happened to us is, supposing you're a gambler, and you've got involved in a game where you're playing actually for peanuts, and you are immensely wealthy. When you get extremely absorbed in the game, even though you're only playing for peanuts, you can lose your temper, and you can be anxious as to who's going to win, who's going to lose. Am I going to lose my peanuts, you see? Whereas you really have nothing to worry about at all. But you've got so absorbed in the details of this game that you've forgotten the larger context in which the game is happening. So in exactly the same way, every individual is so absorbed myopically with his mind in the details of his birth and death that he has completely forgotten the context in which birth and death is occurring. And so, just as the chicken, when you put his beak to a chalk line, can't get off it and is hypnotized, so we have been systematically and progressively hypnotized by our whole upbringing into the sensation that we are only this particular ego in this body. And we believe that and feel it so firmly that the context in which all this has happened is completely repressed. Now, therefore, I want to propose a few things, first of all, in thinking about this. And I would ask you to listen to what I have to say, temporarily postponing the question, what are the practical consequences? What should we do about it? I want to start with a consideration of our ancient ideas about the relation of the individual to the world in terms of fate and free will, or determinism and free will. Because if we actually were aware of all the information that is coming to us through our senses, we would have a very curious sensation which would bug us because we wouldn't be able to find words for it. It would be like this. You would first of all realize that if you didn't be so selective, in other words, if you didn't pay attention to this detail and that detail, but were just simply aware of it all in general, you would get the funny feeling, in the first place, that you were just a puppet, that you were automatically responding to all kinds of physical and social influences around you, and that you couldn't help yourself. You might object to that, or you might alternatively enjoy it. You might get a sensation that you were just floating. You didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to think about any problems. You didn't have to worry about what you ought to do. You would just feel yourself responding. And that would be a very pleasant feeling if you liked it. But on the other hand, depending on your personal constitution, you might feel terribly threatened by it. And you would interpret this sensation as a feeling of unreality. Have you ever suddenly felt that you were dreaming everyday life? That it wasn't quite real? And it spooked you? So you said, gee, it ought to be happening, see? I feel I'm going around in a dream. Because occasionally our mind slips. It's like the tuning dial of a radio. It occasionally wanders off and you get another station. And so in the same way, our minds occasionally slip into another way of seeing things. And people get accidental illuminations and psychoses and all sorts of funny things. But you would get this as a preliminary sensation, and you would interpret it as feeling that you are a puppet on the end of strings being manipulated by events, only because of your previous background, wherein we have all of us been conditioned to believe that part of our life is not under our control, and part of it is. There is this distinction between the voluntary and the involuntary. The voluntary, what we do; the involuntary, what we have to accept passively. The borderline between them is not at all clear. Breathing, for example, is something we have to go on doing, and yet you can acquire the sensation that you are doing the breathing and controlling it according to your will. It's a very vague distinction here. But if you took in all the information, see, you can feel yourself making a decision out of the blue. You say, I'm going to do that, like that, you see, and you don't have any awareness of anything that leads up to it. It just happens, you see. And because that awareness is screened out, you interpret this act of making a decision as a different kind of act from breathing or from growing hair. Well, actually, it isn't different. But we think it's different because of unawareness. When you make a decision, it happens, as the Chinese say, ziran, shizen, of itself, naturally, spontaneously. But we feel that there are things that happen of themselves in contrast to certain things that I do. And that is because of incomplete awareness. But then, if that awareness were to change, and you were to realize that everything is happening of itself, including your decisions, because of your background, you would then veer over to the opposite point of view. Everything is happening involuntarily, and I am left out. I'm a puppet. I simply have to obey. You see? But this would be incorrect. The point is rather this. We don't have a system of nature which is either deterministic or voluntaristic. The relationship of the individual to the environment is not one of the individual as some little thing in the environment which is moved by the environment and responds to the environment passively. Nor, oppositely, do we have a situation in which the individual is a center of activity that all of its own to some extent alters and changes the environment. Both of these opinions are based on lack of awareness or ignorance. That the behavior of the individual and the behavior of the environment are the same process. And you can look at the process from 2 points of view. You can look at it from the point of view of it's all happening to me, or you can look at it from the point of view I'm doing it. These are just two poles of two ways of looking at the same thing. If, for example, you realize that your neurological organization is creating the external world. In other words, there is no such thing as light, weight, heat, color, shape, except in terms of the human nervous system or some other animal nervous system. Then from that point of view, you can see your nervous system as evoking the whole universe. But you can take an opposite point of view, which is equally true, which is that the human nervous system is something in the external world and is entirely dependent on sun and air and light and temperature and so on and so forth. Both points of view are true, but we have not yet, especially in the West, become aware of a logic which can integrate them. And so when we first come to experience this thing as being so, we tend to interpret it in terms of our old logics and our old ways of thinking. So that one person may say, on feeling this, I feel as if I'm just floating around, passively responding to the operations of nature. And another person going to the opposite extreme will interpret this experience as saying, I suddenly realize I'm God, that I actually govern and control everything that happens. These are two ways of looking at exactly the same thing. The point being, then, that there is just one process which is equally the behavior of the organism and the behavior of the environment. That you can look at this process from many points of view, define it in many ways, but you can't really split it up. And so the consequence of this, although I'm not going into this at the moment in any full way, is to learn to act and behave in terms of this vision of the world. Not as you're acting upon the world, not as it acting upon you, but as the unfoldment of a process which, as you understand it, you become more intelligent and act more intelligently. Intelligence is a function of the degree to which you realize that your behavior is one with the behavior of the rest of the world. The more you realize that, the more, one would say, you appear to be better in control, although you're not actually controlling. The difficulty, the essential difficulty that lies in the way of most people seeing this is the fixed notion that the world consists of separate things and separate events. As Teilhard de Chardin put it, the only real atom is the universe. The word atom, you see, in Greek, is atomos. Non, tomos, cut. The uncut. It's the same idea as in Lao Tzu, the uncarved block as a great symbol of naturalness. What cannot be further divided? And so de Chardin says it is the universe that is the only real atom, because if you take anything out of the universe and separate it, you will find it is raveled at all its edges. It is not, in other words, cleanly divisible. But this is something which is left out of our ordinary awareness. Because in our ordinary awareness, we overlook the connections that go between so-called things and so-called events, and make them actually nothing but aspects of one event. It's as if we were looking at everything through a sort of Venetian blind, where intervals are ignored and cut out. Our senses are, of course, as we know, screening devices. The eye responds to a very narrow spectrum of the various forms of light vibrations. We do not see X-rays or cosmic rays. Likewise, our ear responds only to a rather narrow spectrum of sound. We keep screening out. And therefore, not only do we screen with our senses, with the organs of sense, we also screen with the thinking systems by which we interpret what we sense. It's a further act of screening. And so as a result of this, there are gaps. And these gaps are symbolized by the fact that we ignore space. We think, as we all sit around here in this room, you see, that the spaces between each of us as we sit here is nothing at all. It's not important. But actually, it's tremendously important. The spaces between people, and space as a marvelous thing in itself, is as important as, for example, the intervals between tones in music. It is the intervals and the hearing of the intervals that enables you to hear melody. And so it is the space between everything, which instead of being something that divides, it joins. But we ignore it and don't see that space, like the diaphragm in the radio, space is that in which everything happens, and without space, no happening. It's fundamental, but ignored. And there are many other things besides. All kinds of mutual influencing constantly going on. But this is ignored because, for one reason, for two reasons. One, we don't have time to bother with it. We don't think it's important. And we don't think it's important because we have been trained to regard only certain things as important. And that's why in the process, say, of meditation, as it's understood by Buddhists and Taoists, you stop valuing and putting a price on all the various things that you could be aware of. You stop thinking, and you are simply aware. And it suddenly strikes you then that everything is equally important. And you start being amazed at things that you never were amazed at before. Absolutely fascinating. You hear the sound of water. And that's quite as important as anything I've got to say. Only you don't translate it, see? The wisest thing I heard in Japan when I was last there, from Morimoto Roshi, he said, the sound of the rain needs no translation. We were talking about translating Buddhist texts into English. He said, you don't need to do that. The sound of the rain needs no translation. So when you get that perspective and you realize that the divisions of one thing from another are all conceptual, cut out the concepts and see it afresh, and there are no divisions. There are connections. It doesn't mean that in the continuum of the physical world that there are no lines, that there are no solids and spaces and all this kind of thing. It doesn't mean, in other words, that if you saw the world correctly, it would all become a homogenized mass. A lot of people think that that is the nirvana. You know? That doesn't mean that at all. It stays just exactly as you see it now, but it has a completely different sense to it, in which all the wiggles in this world are not separated, but it's a continuous wiggle. I'm greatly interested in the philosophy of wiggles, because this is a wiggly world. Look at the hills. As you fly, as I've just been flying, getting some perspective of nature from an airplane, and its clouds and mountains, all wiggles. But just every now and then one sees these little squares and rectangular patterns and things, and you know that's human beings, busy trying to straighten things out. They somehow disapprove of wiggles, because wiggles are difficult to control. They're slippery. And you want to put that thing there and just say, now, come on. But you see, the trouble with a wiggle is, how do you count wiggles? How do you count the wiggles in a cloud? I mean, formally speaking, is one wiggle a smooth curve like that? Does that constitute a wiggle? Or supposing it has bumps on it, are those each a subordinate wiggle? And how many wiggles does the bump have? It has lots when you start looking at it in a magnifying glass. It goes on forever. So wiggles of the world unite. You've nothing to lose but your names. So you see, this is great continuous wiggliness, for purposes of being controlled and managed, is broken down into what we call things and events. But these are no other than conventional, that is to say, socially agreed divisions between the various forms of nature. But nature is really formless in the sense that it's all one form. Not in the sense that there are nothing that we could stick the name cloud on, but that the naming the cloud a cloud does not separate the cloud from the sky, actually. Just as when you pick up water in a sieve, you don't succeed in separating the water into strips like you would if it was cheese going through a sieve. So all our categorizing leaves the world undivided. In fact, it is simply a way of being able to talk about it in order to agree how we are going to control it and what we're going to do with it. Now this is a point that is so fundamental that I do want to be sure that it's clear. To say, you see, that there really are no things and no events is to most people shocking and startling. It's an affront to common sense. Because we feel, you know, damn it, this is a shoe. And it's a thing, it's there, you see. And, but actually, this isn't a shoe at all. You know, the shoe is a noise. And if this is a noise at all, it's this sort of noise. You can use it for a hat. It has all sorts of possibilities. But it isn't a shoe. Yeah, yeah, right. So, if you see that, the idea of separate things is an abstraction, let's call it that, then this most of all applies to you. As an organism, you are not a separate thing. You are, first of all, you can look at it from 2 points of view. On the one hand, a living organism is something like a flame. A flame, although it appears on a candle to be constant, is a stream of gas. And a flame is never the same for 2 microseconds. It's a constant flowing of energy. Or take a whirlpool in a stream. It appears to have a constant form, but it's flowing all the time. So in exactly the same way, all our bodies appear to have constant form, but we are a flowing of energy. So we keep coming in and out. Also, It isn't only in this way that the constant flow, that you cannot say I'm a separate event. But it's also because everything that could be recognized as a wiggle or a unit of any kind in this world has its existence only in relation to all the rest of them. This is the principle that in Buddhist philosophy is called Jiji Muge, the mutual interpenetration of all things and events. This is very important. I'm sure some of you have recently read in, say, the Scientific American about holograms, a method whereby you can take a small square out of a photographic negative and by the use of laser beams reconstruct the whole negative out of which it was taken. Because the little part is nurtured and comes to be in a field of forces in such a way that all the lines of force within the little part imply the lines of force of the total photograph when it was taken. It can be reconstructed. Maybe Wynne can explain this more accurately than I can. But this essentially is the hologram. Because you see, every part, anything that can be designated as a part of something, implies the whole, just as the whole implies the part. Thus, a clever anthropologist can take a jawbone and can reconstruct from the jawbone, through all his anthropological knowledge, the beast or man to which it originally belonged. You say a jawbone like this, you see, implies this kind of a skull and so on and so forth. So every single thing in this world exists only in relation to the whole system, to all the other things. Because the important point to realize here is that existence is relationship. Relationship is another word for existence. There is no yang without the yin. It is the relationship of yang and yin that enables yang to be possible and yin to be possible, solid to be possible and space to be possible, up and down, life and death, being and non-being. It is a relationship. So that, for example, if I have a drum, but there is no skin on the drum, it doesn't matter how hard I hit it, it will make no sound. Because the sound is the relationship of the drum skin and the hand. And you can carry that principle all the way along. That, in other words, if I shout in a completely non-resonating environment, I will make no noise. In other words, if I shout in a vacuum, there is no sound. Because I have to make waves, you see, and I can't make waves if there's no water. So the existence is relationship all the way along. And fundamentally then, the relationship of all of us together, of all society, constitutes every one of us. We are, as individuals, as personalities, what we are in terms of a human community and of an interlocking complex of communities. And you may remember when you were children, I remember it very vividly, how my personality changed in relation to each community that I went into. In other words, I was one boy at home. I was a completely different boy among my peer group in school. I was another boy altogether when visiting my uncle. And I've realized I had all these different personalities in relation to different communities. And eventually, I put them together in some sort of way and integrated. But I feel still, although I've got them more or less together, I like to come on differently in different sets of people and play the joker, which instead of playing a fixed role, and you can say, well, is that always you Can we rely upon you always to have this sort of behavior, mannerisms, and reactions? You say, no, I'm not going to get fixed up in that. I'm going to play tricks. But you did notice that, you see, when you were a child, because, you see, you were being defined all the time by the groups you were in. And so you are what you are as a person, that is to say, as playing a role in life in relation to the groups around with which you move. And that is a little model of the fact that everything is what it is in its place. Now, for example, it has been a sort of convention of scientific thought hitherto, especially in the kind of science of the 19th century, to try to understand anything and say what it is by a process of analysis. You understand it by asking, what is it made of? How is it composed? How was it put together? And so you dissect it. You get your microscopes out, and you try to dissolve it down to the smallest possible component parts. And that gives a certain explanation of it, you see. But what is equally important is to look in the other direction. A thing, what anything is defined not only in terms of what it's made of, but of when it is and where it is. Its context in time and space. Just as the meaning of a word is dependent on the context of the sentence or the paragraph or the book in which it is found. So, likewise, we with our rather myopic way of looking at things, because analysis, the ability to analyze and to think analytically, comes from great skill in dividing wiggles. See, you may think that this is a very, very fine wiggle, you see, but I can make wiggles so little that you can't keep track of them because you're not as sharp as I am, see. I'm going to make wiggles, and we're going to have a little competition. Who can make the smallest wiggle and keep track of them? Because that's the test. If you can keep track of them, and you can prove it to someone else, because if you get down so small nobody can keep track of you, then they don't know whether you're a charlatan or not. But if you can keep track of the wiggles and prove to other people that you kept track of them, see, this is the whole game of scholarly one-upmanship. If you can keep track of it, same with certain kinds of music, you see, you can do very complicated rhythms, and they'll believe you if you can do it again. And it's not enough to do it once. They say, do that again. Oh, was that a fluke? That shows, you see, you're in control, and you've been able to count out the beats. So, through the analytical mind, it pays attention to the details. We have got great skill in doing that. But you do that at the expense of neglecting completely the other side of things, is in what context does every individual wiggle happen. See, that's just the other side of it. It's very important to define the wiggle, but you can't define the wiggle unless the wiggle has an environment. The outside of the wiggle is as important as the inside. So in the same way, everybody has an outside and everybody has an inside. We identify ourselves with what is inside. Say, that's me. And thereby ignore the fact that what is outside you is just as much your outside as what is inside you is your inside. And that's always overlooked. And I mean, when I talk about your outside, I don't mean just the surface of your skin. I mean everything outside your skin. That's your outside. And if that isn't functioning in a certain way, the inside doesn't function either. They go together. It's like when a snake moves. The snake makes a curl, and so one side of it is convex and the other side is concave. Which side moves first? Why, they both move together. And so in the same way, the inside world, the outside world are not different, in the sense that they're not separate. They're different, yes. One's inside, the other's outside, but they're not separate. They move together. Only we're unaware of it, in the ordinary way, through a kind of psychological myopia, of fixing on, of being hung up on certain ways of looking at things. There's a Buddhist word, klesha, in Sanskrit, bonno in Japanese, that we normally translate attachment or defiling passion. The exact translation of klesha in modern American is hang up. It's a perfect word for it, to have a hang up. And so to be hung up on a fixed way of looking at things, that the world is only divided in this way and that way and the other way, is to fail to see what I've been describing then as the going togetherness, the inseparability of all insides from all outsides and vice versa, and of all organisms from their environments and vice versa. You can get this very clearly when you realize that if you get hung up on the viewpoint of separateness, then even your body is not a unity. You are just a mass of cells. And if then you take in physics, you're not even cells, you're molecules. Not even molecules, just atoms. Not even atoms, just subatomic particles, wavicles or whatever. And you disintegrate everything into that, and you realize that there are vast spaces between all these tiny little wiglets, whatever they are, wavicles. Huge spaces. I mean, if a molecule in your body was magnified to the size of a tennis ball, the nearest one would be quite a way away. Well, what ties all this together? You know, how can you look at that as a unity? Well, it's tied together by space. Fields of force, gravitation. And so in exactly the same way, look at us behaving around here from a larger level of magnification. And you can very easily see that we are just as tied together as the molecules in our hands. And that generation after generation, you know, we come and go. You look at the leaves coming on the trees in the spring. And you can say, you can describe this in so many different ways. You can say these are new leaves. Last year's leaves fell off and have fallen into the ground. And now a new generation of leaves come, which are quite different. And if the leaf had an ego, you see, it would say, wow-wee, I've come into being. I'm new. But from another point of view, you could just say, the tree is leafing again. This is something the tree does, like every so often. A man gets up in the morning and he shaves. He's shaving, see? And he stops doing that. Next morning, he's shaving again. Now, is the shaving, is it something that has an ego? When every day's shave is a different shave? It is from one point of view. It is different, but it's also shaving. It's the same. It's because we are so fascinated with the individual details of people that generation after generation we say they're quite different. But somebody who really was from Mars and didn't understand people would say they keep on coming. They're just the same ones coming back. So every year's leaves are the same old leaves coming back, see? They die, and they are reabsorbed, and they keep coming back. The thing keeps doing it again. But there are these spaces in it, you see? It's like the troughs between the crests of a wave. And we say, where there are those spaces, we don't see anything, so we say, well, that's finished. So when you die, you think, well, that's finished. Too bad. But you see, what you are really is the energy field, and it keeps doing you. It keeps peopling. And it's you who keep peopling. Who else is responsible? Only, of course, we mustn't admit that. We're responsible for this. So the whole game is to pretend you aren't. See that it's happening, and it's nothing to do with me. I'm not in control of this. In this morning's session, I was emphasizing primarily the theoretical aspects of ecological awareness, showing how our differentiation between separate things and events is an abstraction, and that the whole world is an inseparable unity, not of separate parts, but of the kind of system in which everything that might be called a part when we talk about it, everything that might be called a part is in fact an expression or function of the whole thing. And that if we came to our senses, we would be aware of ourselves, not as only on the inside of our skins, but we would be aware that the outside is us too. That there is a relationship between the organism and the environment, the subject and the object, and the individual and the world, such that the two presuppose each other. And I did get around to the point of mentioning towards the end the reason how and why this can become apparent if our minds are not constantly obsessed with verbiage. If, in other words, we can come to contemplating, seeing, feeling the actual world without putting names and labels on it. In other words, to see it directly rather than thinking about it. For, as I said, these separations are conceptual. Now, I want to take this into a more practical dimension this afternoon. And that is to say that hand in hand with this whole question of overcoming the hallucination of separateness, there goes also the formation of a new style of relationship to the material present. It's very important, you see, first of all, to realize that all reality is present. That the present moment is where you have always lived and where you will always live. There is no other time than now. Time past and time future are also abstractions. But in our culture in particular, we have a very bad relationship to the material present. And not only to the present, but also to that aspect of the same thing which is material. And this comes out so strongly in the way in which we educate our children. We do not, in our schools, really have anything very much which relates people to the material present. And thus our achievements in regard to the handling of the material present are extremely shoddy. School prepares people for a kind of Brahmin's existence. That is to say, for literary, verbal operations. It educates us to be bureaucrats, insurance salesmen, bankers' clerks, accountants, and lawyers, maybe doctors, and so on. And a person who is going on, say, in high school, and is thought not fit for college, is encouraged to take reluctantly offered courses in trades and manual skills. And in England, where the state of affairs is much worse than it is here even, they always make jokes about American universities where you can get a BA degree in basket weaving. Because that's infra dig. That is loss of face in an academic community that there should be basket weaving courses. Bad enough to have a degree in physical education, But the point of the matter is that we are so obsessed with the life of abstractions, with problems of status, with problems of the world as symbolized rather than the world to be symbolized, that most of us don't relate to physical existence at all. Now, I remember, and I mentioned this in one of those leaflets I sent out, but I remember very well in 1936 in London at the World Congress of Faiths when Suzuki Daisetsu was present. He's the one who's written all the essays on Zen Buddhism, the great scholar. And he had made a very, very significant contribution to the Congress, various lectures and discussions he had held. And at the final meeting of the Congress, they took over the Queen's Hall, great big auditorium, and they set as the subject matter for the evening the supreme spiritual ideal, upon which representatives of all the great religious traditions got up and delivered themselves of volumes of hot air. Finally, Suzuki was the last speaker. And he got up and he said approximately, "I am feeling very confused tonight. I am simple countryman from a faraway place, and I find myself in this assembly of so learned people. I am asked to talk about supreme spiritual ideal. Seems to me I do not know what supreme spiritual ideal is, so I look up spiritual in dictionary, and I cannot understand. He said, you have around here a very big city, and I walk along street and very prosperous, but it's not right. You have spiritual over here, you have material world over here, and both are unreal." And then he went on to give a description of his house and garden in Japan. And at the end of it, he had a standing ovation. For somehow he was real. He came across as somebody who was lovable, intelligible, and human, as distinct from a mere preacher. And he made this intensely important point, that if you understand the spiritual correctly, it is not different from the material. The material is the spiritual. But in order to see why that is so, one first has to make a clear difference between the material and the abstract, and to understand that the abstract doesn't mean the same thing as the spiritual. The abstract world is a world of symbols, a world of words, a world of concepts, which has the same relation to the physical universe as the menu to the dinner or as money to wealth. I mean money in the sense of bookkeeping entries in a bank or dollar bills. One must be very careful, therefore, not to confuse the spiritual and the abstract. If by the spiritual we designate the domain of ultimate reality, the unified or more strictly non-dual energy of the universe that I was talking about this morning, that has nothing whatsoever really to do with abstractions. What we call physical reality, the material world, is much closer to what would be meant by spiritual than anything abstract is. And but the thing is that when we form in our minds, the average person who talks about the physical world, he has a concept of the physical world, which is what really should be referred to as materiality when one uses that word in a put-down way. If, for example, we talk about, I could even say this to theologians and they would eventually understand me. If we talk about the evils of the flesh, the word the flesh doesn't mean the body in the sense of this. The flesh, as something evil, represents a conception of the body as something to be exploited in order to satisfy one's spiritual emptiness. And thus, too, when we speak of materialism, we aren't really talking about materialism. We're talking about an abstract conception of the value of the material world. Real materialism would, of course, be the love of material, which is something quite different from materialism as one sees it in practice. So it's very important to realize that when we say the physical world and we talk about matter as something which is antithetical to the spiritual, you are not talking about this. Because all this doesn't have those kind of qualities that we would call materiality as against the spiritual. If you really get in touch with your senses, with the so-called physical world, you're in for many surprises. First of all, if you go back to the point I made, that there really is only the present, you will see that what we call this physical world is not something expanded in time, stretched out over time. It isn't, and it is not material also in the sense of being composed of stuff. You see, one of our problems in the West is we think about the relationship of the spiritual to the physical by analogy with form and matter, or rather with clay as matter and the form as the pot made out of the clay. And therefore we've never been able to put the two together because our conception of matter as something essentially like clay, a sort of primordial stuff, this has no intelligence, nor does it possess energy. And therefore, when you think of the world as a sort of cooperation or a mixture of form and matter, you have therefore to invoke an external agency to inform matter and to bring it into shape, to order it, and to produce art. But this dualism of form and matter is really rather meaningless. Nobody ever saw an immaterial form or a formless material. There really is no such thing as stuff out of which the universe is made. Stuff is actually a word for looking at the world with bad focus. When your focus on something is not clear, it is fuzzy. And this fuzziness or indistinctness is stuff. When your focus on the world is clear, you see pattern, you see details, you see structure. Now, as you look more deeply into any structure, it starts to get fuzzy again. And therefore you ask, of what stuff is this structure made? Stuff meaning fuzz. But then again, when you turn up the level of magnification, and it once becomes bright and clear, you see within the great structures and the great patterns, smaller ones. So you always encounter the world as patterning, never as stuff. And so our physical world that surrounds us is in a way immaterial. It is a fantastic pulsation of vibrations which give an illusion of solidity in just the same way that if I take a lighted cigarette in the dark and rapidly revolve it, you get the illusion of a continuous circle of fire. So the apparent motion of the present moment from the past to the future gives an illusion of continuity, as if there was something extended in time. And in exactly the same way, the table, because it is vibrating with such tremendous energy, gives an illusion of solidity in exactly the same way as the blades of a propeller or an electric fan when they're in rotation. And in the same way as you will come to trouble if you try to put your finger through the fan. The only reason you can't get your finger through the table, it's going even faster than a fan. And it bounces your finger off. When you feel hardness, your finger is being bounced off because of this tremendous energy that lies in and as the table. Likewise, it's also in your finger. So, what we're actually confronted with, what is here and now ever, is certainly not a material world as we ordinarily conceive it, but is something intensely magical and strange. And the more, Spinoza once said, the more you know of particular things, the more you know of God. And then put it in another way. If you want to find out what is the spiritual, what is Buddha nature, what is Brahman, what is Tao, the best way is to go directly to the physical world and find out. The physical world as you are it and as everything around you is it, the immediate experience. Now to go back, this, as I said, is something which our culture, which WASP culture in particular, neglects, because we are obsessed with abstract attainments. And this goes back to some curious factors in our history. To introduce this matter, I have to refresh your minds about caste, strangely enough. In ancient Hindu society, there are 4 castes, respectively Brahmins, who are priests, theologians, philosophers, and intellectuals. Kshatriya, who are warriors and rulers, politicians. Vaishya, who are merchants, and Shudra, who are laborers, blue-collar workers. These castes have something peculiar about them in the fact that they are eternal. Let me say perennial. They still exist, even though we don't admit it. There are Kshatriya people around, and they are very different from Brahmins. The typical fraternity American, with his crew cut and his uses alcohol, is aggressive, likes football, and so on, he's a Kshatriya type. The professorial, quiet fellow is a Brahmin. The businessman is a Vaishya, and our blue-collar people are Shudras. They're still there. And they are all necessary to each other. They balance each other in a very fascinating way. The Brahmin cannot get on by himself. He needs the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and the Shudra. And likewise, every one of them needs the others. But there was a curious revolution in Europe at the time we call the Reformation, when the Vaishyas got the upper hand of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. The feudal aristocracy began to lose power in the face of, say, the great merchant bankers of Italy and the burghers of Central Europe. The Brahmins, who were the priests of the Roman Catholic Church, began to lose power because their doctrine was criticized and fell under suspicion. For you must see that the Protestant religion was the creation of the burgher cities of Europe, of places like Geneva, Frankfurt, and one must add London, Edinburgh. And immediately, money values began to dominate Christian theology. For example, the number of holy days was very strictly cut down by all Protestant sects because those were holidays. And the merchants didn't want their apprentices taking all these holidays off and not busying themselves. And so, always connected with the Protestant ethic are the virtues of frugality, saving money, saving up for the future, and in such things are Vaishya ideals running a bit wild. And thus you see our ethic, since the common sense ethic, that is to say, the basic conception of the good life as it is held in the United States, is very largely a creation of bourgeois Protestantism. We have a very bad relation to the material present. Because that's one thing that the Vaishya can't maintain by himself, any more than the Brahmin or the Kshatriya or the Shudra could maintain it by himself. We have a whole world based on this. Two things. Save up. There's a good time coming. So put your money aside, invest it. Secondly, which is somewhat contradictory, happiness consists in the possession of things. A lot of people, when they feel inadequate, bored, unfulfilled, try to get rid of this sensation by going shopping. A lot of people spend all their daytime shopping. That's the thing to do. You go out and shop. There are women galore who go into San Francisco every day just to shop and come back loaded with all kinds of things. But these things are not true material possessions. For at least two reasons. Number one, most of them aren't well made. Number two, you can't use that many things. You can store them, you can put them away, you can show your friends that you've got this and that. But you can't live in 6 houses at once. You can't ride more than 2 horses at a time, unless you're doing some sort of a circus act, you know? You can't drive more than 1 car at a time. So we tend to become absolutely overloaded with possessions and have the greatest difficulty, therefore, in moving ourselves around. Because every time we move, we have to carry all the stuff with us. Let's take the comparison between a Japanese living room and a British, American, or German living room. You see the Japanese living room, you have a table and some cushions and the floor. And you don't have any beds. You sleep in a futon, in a quilt, and that's delightful. You don't, therefore, have to haul beds around. You don't have overstuffed chairs, which stand in most rooms like gun emplacements. You know, these huge things. Vast things that have to be pushed around, very heavy. We, in other words, are absolutely cluttered with enormously heavy objects. And it doesn't redound to our true material comfort, because we are always using our muscles to lug them around. They have to be taken care of. They have to be cleaned. The moths have to be kept out of them. They're a perfect pest. So we don't really understand furniture. Now, I would think furniture and a house and a shelter over you is one of the most important things in life. Shelter is fundamental. But when you see what shelter most people in the United States have provided for themselves, you're aghast. Clapboard boxes, miles and miles and miles of them, that you wouldn't want a dog to live in. Have you ever looked at the furniture in Dagwood's home? The absolutely uninspired junk. It has nothing whatsoever to recommend it. It isn't good design, it isn't fun, it's just nowhere. What's something else of material importance that really, after all, we ought to know something about? Clothes. Well, by and large, we are shockingly clothed, as compared with many other people. Men go around looking like funeral directors in the most uncomfortable survivals of military uniforms. Women wear frocks and dresses and things that are to cover up amazing systems of pulleys and blocks and tackles. And, you know, it's a sleazy, and they have no real joyous color. Occasionally, I mean, we all know exceptions. But I'm talking about the generality of the culture. The clothes don't look as if anybody really enjoyed wearing them. They're worn because one has to be dressed and covered up and decent, and therefore they're worn rather apologetically. Furthermore, they wear out in nothing flat. And to buy good clothes, you have to go outside the country. There are, of course, if you want to dress in a rather traditional way, you go and get British tweeds from the Hebrides. But if you want to dress colorfully and beautifully, you have to go to Mexico and get gorgeous materials, or to India and get silk for saris, or to Java and get batiks for sarongs. And these things will last forever. They're beautifully made by people who had a real enthusiasm about making them. Because in the life of the people who make such things, they don't make a differentiation between working and playing. But in a culture where you work and play is different, you work in order to make money to play, this is insane. Because you spend most of the time working. And then what you carry, if you don't really value the work, I mean, you're lucky if you've got work that you really enjoy doing. But if you don't really value the work, all you get out of it is money. Then you come home with that and you're supposed to play. Well, you're pretty tired to begin with. And we just don't play. That's all there is to it. You might play Saturday or something when there's a day off. But in the evening, very few people actually play. They sit and passively watch television. And they've got all the money in the world. I mean, compared with Hindus and Africans and so on, we live like princes. But we don't enjoy it. Not really. There's no gusto for it. You would think that people would come home and have orgies and banquets and with all that money. And they don't. It's just a sort of constant disappointment. Well, going back to clothes, I can illustrate another way in which our clothes are made without regard for material values. Most clothes are made of cloth. Now, when you weave cloth, cloth has a certain nature. It comes out in a long, wide strip, which is rectangular. We take this material, woven this way, and we try to fit it to the contours of the body by shaping, by doing things with rectangular material that rectangular material just doesn't want to do. To fit the sleeves of a man's jacket. It doesn't want to do that. And therefore, our jackets don't fold up properly. Whenever you take them out of a suitcase, they have to go to the dry cleaners to be pressed, or your wife has to iron it. Our shirts, a man's shirt is the most ridiculous construction. It will not fold unless you're an expert laundress. There's nothing you can do about it. And it always comes out of a suitcase ruffled. And it requires all kinds of care to get the thing ready to be wearable. And it's white and gets filthy and nothing flat. There's no rationale to it whatsoever. Nor to the necktie, which has to be worn with it. Sort of noose to strangle you with. But if I may point out, a Japanese kimono is quite different. It follows the nature of cloth. The rectangular forms of the cloth, if you stretch it out like that, it hangs in a rectangle right here from your sleeve, and it falls over you. It hasn't been forced to fit you, and therefore it fits you comfortably. The cloth conforms itself to you by its nature, and therefore gives you a certain dignity. I once saw a Tibetan woolen garment. It was a cloak. And it was prepared by their method, which is they have a method of pounding wool rather than weaving it. And they make it into a great big, again, it's a rectangle. And it's a double rectangle, the front one and the back one. The front one is split down the center. And at the sides, there's a place for the sleeves to go through, and beyond that, it's stitched. So you just got this sort of, if you put it out like that, it looks like a sort of sandwich board. Well, we had this one evening, and we got every man in the room to put it on. And there were about 5 men. And it turned all of them into kings. They looked absolutely regal in this thing. It was so dignified and so exquisitely beautiful. I have a Japanese friend who told me he always wore Western clothes in Japan. And I asked him why. I said, it's absurd. I said, you have the most comfortable clothes anybody ever invented. What on earth do you go around in a Western business suit for? Oh, he said, I wouldn't be seen dead in Kyoto in a kimono. You can't run for a bus in a kimono. It's true. But what a degradation, you see, of the human being. You've got to be someone who's got to run for a bus now, you see. Whereas if you put on a kimono, you're very comfortable, but you have to be leisurely. you have to stroll rather than rush. And that slows you down. Because you see, all people who are in a rush are not related to the material present. Supposing, let's take, you're in a rush to get coffee when you get up in the morning. So what do? You take instant coffee. And that's a punishment for being in a hurry. It doesn't taste of coffee, not really. So because you forced it, it's like forcing the growth of tomatoes. They don't taste of tomatoes anymore. Forced apples, they're called delicious. They're nothing but wet pith. So this is very important. This is showing that we aren't here. We're insane. We're not all there, as they say. But trying to get to something, the result, the thing we thought we wanted, the thing that we thought would be what would make us happy. You've got to get something. Now, it's true. In order to not be hungry, you have to eat. And therefore, when you eat, there's a certain satisfaction. You feel all right. But then, when you begin to consider that life is going to wear out and there are all sorts of problems, disease, change, and misfortune, and you get depressed, and then in order to feel happy, you eat when you don't need to eat, then you begin to get obesity and indigestion. And wonder why the possession of all this great food isn't doing anything for you. It's supposed to. And so in the same way with property of all kinds, when it is used to get the thing that you look forward to in the future and don't seem to have now, it becomes a complete delusion. And you can't understand because you think that the possession of these things ought to make you happy. The ad men have persuaded you that if you could get this kind of car, this kind of yacht, this kind of house, this kind of scene, whatever it may be, you should, that's the thing in life, that's what's important. And it doesn't make people happy at all. And then they wonder why it doesn't and feel cheated. And they have to go to psychoanalysts and churches and things like that to be persuaded that it's coming sometime. Somehow, the thing that is always seems to be missing. And there's nothing missing at all. Except, supposing you're absolutely starved and you just don't have the normal flow of energy through your organism, then of course you need food. Or if you're freezing, you need shelter. But in the ordinary way, when you are fed and sheltered, there isn't anything missing. It's all here. But nobody is here to see it. Everybody is wandering after something else in the distance. And of course, this is preeminently true with two other aspects of life. I've discussed housing, furniture, and clothing. But more specifically, food. In the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture is unbelievably bad when you consider it by and large. The reason being that we eat food because it's good for us. And that's a dreadful thing to do. Because it means that you look at the food from the point of view of abstract dietetics rather than concrete taste. And wherever dietitians get interfering with cooking, it is utterly destroyed. In every university from coast to coast, where you would think would be centers of culture, the institutional food is unbelievably abominable. And the scholars are ashamed to come out about it because and protest and lay down the law because they're supposed to be devoted to higher things. And after all, what you eat, just so long as it's got the right chemicals in it, isn't very important. But what this is, you see, the trouble with that is two things. To eat in order to live, sort of that it's good for you, is, what do you mean good for you? It means that it helps you to go on into the future. But what is the point of going on into the future when all the meals ahead of you are these unappetizing things that are just going to enable you to go on into the future. And the second thing is that eating in this spirit is very disrespectful to all the creatures you have killed in order to eat. It's even disrespectful to an onion to eat it improperly. Onions are living creatures, and if you cut up an onion for dinner, you should reverence the onion. You should respect it, because if you don't have a feeling of love for the onion, for the fish, for whatever you eat, you won't cook it properly, and you won't enjoy it. Cooking is a process of loving. And it is a paying of respect to these marvelous beings which we ingest in order to go on living. So this entirely futuristic, dietetic attitude to food is, again, you see, a question of purely quantitative thinking, of lack of relation to the material world. I may make one other rather important aspect of life is lovemaking. Here again is a subject entirely neglected in our education. From any practical point of view, I mean, there are a lot of theoretical works, some of which are fantastic and grotesque. But as a fine art, when you compare what goes on in most bedrooms with the things that are suggested in the Kama Sutra, the difference is amazing. That there could be a real great art as between lovers, husbands and wives and so on, is something, again, that we don't consider because, once again, although sex is fun, we go about it not really because we enjoy it. We can't admit that, but it's good for us. It's a healthy outlet. And also, it's necessary, of course, for having children. And that's also something for the future, you see? And likewise, when it gets to children, we don't relate to children in the material present very well. This is especially true of what one calls child-centered families. Here is a frustrated mama and papa who feel guilty for some reason or other. Either they didn't really make it in life the way they wanted to make it, and they hope their children will. And they feel that anyway, the reason why I am earning a living and you are a housewife is that it's for the sake of our children. We live as husband and wife in order to bring up children. Now, this is completely backwards. If a husband and wife have a vocation in life, that is to say, they are deeply interested in and devoted to living. Supposing the husband is a doctor, and he is fascinated with healing people, and that's really what he's about. The children, if permitted to do so, will catch his fascination. If the wife loves working in the kitchen, the children actually want to help. But we don't allow them to, because what we do is, in an industrial society, you can't possibly have children around the factory or the office. In more primitive agricultural societies, you can have children around the farm, around the shop, and so on. And in the countries like Mexico, and it used to be so in Japan before they shrilled them all after school, the children worked along with their parents and learned their crafts. But now we first of all say, no, we're going to do something. We're going to propitiate you with toys. And these are fake plastic replicas of things that adults play with, like guns and dolls. And they're always they're always frustrating. They never quite come up to expectations. The children therefore break them, and it reduces them to fury. And at the end of the day, every household I know in good, nice American homes where there are children, they are strewn from end to end with disintegrated plastic. Papa is coming home from the office with a mysterious commodity called money, which is, you've got to bring it, but nobody's really interested. And so the house has to be tidy for him to get back. Therefore, there's a screaming, knock-down, drag-out battle with Mama trying to get all the children to clean up and throw this stuff away. And he comes home from a job in which nobody is interested because they have no part in it. The wife knows nothing about it except in a theoretical way. The children know nothing about it because it's something he does off there. And then all his interest, if he has any interest in his job at all, off there with the community of people with whom he works in that situation, he comes back, and with people to whom he now has absolutely no real relationship whatever, he's supposed to be a good pal and a nice, kind husband. And that is why in all our comic magazines, the father of the family is portrayed as a clown. Invariably. All the jokes are on poor old Dad. Whew. But again, you see, this is abstractionism. It's the result, for example, the whole family set up in our culture is an institution hanging over from agrarian civilization, which just doesn't work in an urban industrial civilization. And we keep it up because that's the way things are supposed to be. And we've never rethought human relationships in immediate relation to this new kind of situation in which we're living. So those families that thrive and get on reasonably well with each other are fortunate flukes. Which there will always be a certain number. I could go on endlessly with this discussion of our lack of relation. I mean, let's just take our notions of feminine beauty. They're entirely fabricated by some curious creeps who edit Vogue magazine and Harper's Bazaar to make stuffed dummies who, when actually encountered, are about as comfortable as falling into the middle of a bicycle. And you know, poor women, they're always having to live up to the image of some movie star or somebody who is the great type of the day. They feel their husbands will be disappointed if they don't look like that. And that's because we set up these ideal external surface forms of beings, having no sensitivity to the substance, to the weight, to the volume, to the temperature, and above all to the smell. It is indeed the sense of smell among all matters of the material present is the most repressed in this culture. And therefore, interestingly enough, it is one of the main channels of unconscious communication. Whatever is repressed is, as Jung would say, put into the unconscious and thereby activated in a special way. So a great deal of ESP, or telepathic communication, intuitive likes and dislikes we form for other people, are the result of the sense of smell, which we don't recognize consciously because we are not attending to it. And the word smell means bad smell. It smells. You know the story about Dr. Johnson, who never bathed, you know, and he was traveling in a coach, and a very dignified lady got in and sat down and said to him, "You smell." And he said, "Madam, on the contrary, you smell. I stink." But you see, smell is essentially bad smell. In English, there are only 3 adjectives peculiarly used for qualities of smell: fragrant, acrid, pungent. All other adjectives used for smell are borrowed from taste or some other sense. It's a repressed, you see. We're not really aware of smell. And so we want the human body to smell of disinfectants and things like that, rather than its own natural, interesting flavors. And so everybody is scrubbed and over-cleaned and squirted with alcohol or something so that they shan't smell. But actually they do smell. only they smell of kind of a lab instead of people. So you can see in these many ways that we're not here, and we're not present to materiality because of the strange notion, you see, that the material present is a hoax. You say, lay not up to yourselves treasure upon earth where moth and rust corrupt, but lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven. Well, the way we've interpreted that saying is, lay up treasure in the future. Take out your eternal life insurance policy, you see. So it's coming. Actually, treasure in heaven is now. But we think that the real now world, you see, is disintegrating, crumbling, and therefore is bad. But that's not the reason. The fact that, the real world now is always unseizable. It's changing. You can't grasp it. There's nothing to hold on to. But that's why it's spiritual. When you lean on it, it collapses. But don't lean on it. Live in it, but don't lean on it. Don't try to hold it. Because in just the same way as when you embrace someone and you try to hold too hard, you squeeze the breath out of them. And therefore you strangle them. So in the same way, you don't grab hold of the world. You can't sense it that way. I cannot feel whatever this is by doing this, you see. I can't get the maximum taste out of beef by grinding it to pieces with my teeth and forcing my tongue against it. Because what I do is I dull the nerve ends. It's a kind of a light touch. You let it flow through your fingers. And so by letting life slip, and it's always slipping, it's now ever changing. It's the more it runs, the more it stays. The more it stays, the more it runs. That's the way it is. And if you don't hold on to it, it's always here. If you do hold on to it, it's always running away. So you suddenly discover that this is the most shocking thing, you see, that the physical world, right here and now, this absolutely concrete moment, is everything that you could ever have imagined the beatific vision to be. This is quite startling, but it's so, if you are really wide awake. I have thought of a sort of fantasy, and I'll try and describe it. When you read about the beatific vision in the Paradiso of Dante, you get this fantastic description of the sort of rainbow rose. At the center, vivid white light, which you can't look at. Just dazzling white light. And then as it goes out from that, you get all the colors of the spectrum, going out into violet, and then going out into black. But it's black so transparent, like obsidian, that it's luminous black. And then again, suddenly, vivid white in a great arc comes around the black, and it does the trick again. And now, that's not all it can do. The rays start waving, see, and the whole thing starts shimmering like waves. And then it says, no, that's not all we can do. Then they do curlicues, every conceivable kind of complexity. Then they start making angles. All the light starts dancing. You see, and you could imagine those Buddhist mandalas where there are radiances full of myriads of Buddhas, all dancing, all rattling bells and thunderbolts and swords, and the whole thing is going ga-cha, ga-cha, ga-cha. Then suddenly it goes into another dimension, see? There's more of it. And then it starts getting sound dimensions going with all this color, and smell dimensions going with the sound. And the sound gets so deep and bass and so vibrant that it becomes solid and you can touch it. And the thing gets more and more complicated, and suddenly, before you know where you are, here it is. We're just that thing, reach this degree of complexity. See? Just like that. But it's never somewhere else, you see. You don't get it anywhere but here. Now, if you try to find it here and say, now, golly, he said this right now. I've really got to pay attention to now, see? And you try to look at that, you see, and bring now into focus and really look at it. You're still pushing it away. It has to come to you. You can't seek now, because the moment you seek it, you're not looking at the real now, you're looking at one just ahead. See? So, in sum, this necessity of relating to the material present is one of the cardinal components of a good ecological attitude. Because greed, which is essentially discontent with the present, admittedly, some people living on the edge of poverty have an inadequate material present from a physical point of view. But it is the greed of the well taken care of that is so terrifying. The people who have enough to eat and wear and clothe and are still greedy, and therefore go out to exploit this earth and drag every last ounce of wealth out of it, which is immediately turned into rubbish and poison gas, because they can't be alive here at the moment. So let's take an intermission. In yesterday's session, 2 sessions, I covered first the ecological conception of an organism's relationship to its environment, and thus, of course, of the individual's relationship to the universe. And I was trying to show you that this is not a question of 2 systems that are separate, acting upon each other or interacting. It is a question rather of a single system of energy, expressed with great complexity, which is one process, one activity. It is possible to become aware that this is so, not simply theoretically, but as a matter of sensation. And when one becomes aware of it in that way, the feeling is at first curious and is apt to be misinterpreted. It can be felt either as if you were sort of floating, that is, completely passive, not doing anything, not making any exertion of will, but as if all your behavior was simply happening. That is one way of feeling it. Another way of feeling it is the sensation that you are God and making everything happen. These are the polar opposite ways of feeling the same thing. And when people, for one reason or another, slip into this kind of sensation, and it can happen by accident, they may jump to very strange conclusions, depending on their background, their religious upbringing, because it is that background which gives them a language in which to express to others and to themselves how they feel. But you must be very clear about this and understand it theoretically thoroughly, just in case this ever happens to you, so that you won't be accused of being crazy. It is not, you see, that your own individual organism is the puppet of everything else, responding to it as a billiard ball responds to being hit by a cue. It is not also that you as an individual are an independent source of energy which pushes the world around. Both these views are based on a false assumption that the individual organism is really separate from the world. That's the false assumption. And we think about this situation by analogy with billiards, because Newton thought that way. Descartes thought that way. And Newton and Descartes have molded the common sense of the average person living in the 20th century, even though our science has abandoned the mechanics of Newton. Certainly it has in physics, it certainly has in biology, although I find that in psychology people still talk and think in a Newtonian way, that, for example, Freud structured the organism of psychology of the human psyche by analogy with hydraulics. So you must call Freudianism a form of psychohydraulics. The unconscious is the deeps. Sexual energy is represented like the flow of a river, which can be dammed up, repressed. It has to be provided with outlets. These are all hydraulic terms. And hydraulics is a form of Newton's mechanics. Because you see, in Newtonian mechanics, which is based really on billiards, the balls are standing for atoms, and they bang each other around. And so everything is explained. The movement of ball A is explained by the behavior of balls B, C, D, and E, and so on, insofar as they impinge against it. And you have to go back and back and back trying to figure out how it all got started. Who pushed it first? And who pushed him? You see? Well, this model won't do anymore. Things just don't behave that way because they are not separate from each other in the first place. This is the point I wanted to make clear in this first round of discussion that we had yesterday, that the differentiation of the world is not separation, any more than when you see many waves on the ocean. They are different waves, but it's all the one ocean waving. And you can't have half a wave, for example, a wave that is crest without trough. Half waves are just not found in nature. And so in the same way, you can't find solids except in space, and you won't find space except where there are solids, because they are aspects of each other in rather the same way as in magnetism. The positive and negative, or north and south poles, are always found together. You can't have a purely north-poled magnet. And in order to have a current, an electric current flowing, it must be polarized. It will not flow until both poles are hitched. So, in the same way, there is a polar relationship between the individual and the world. They are both aspects of a single energy. And so there is no question of things being controlled and moved and pushed by other things as billiard balls are, or billiard balls appear to be from a certain superficial point of view. We've just got this huge being, although being is not quite the right word, because existence is composed of being and non-being, corresponding to solid and space, crest and trough of wave. And because fundamentally the energy of the world is vibratory. It's on and off. And there is no off without on, and no on without off. To be or not to be is not the question, because to be implies not to be as much as not to be implies to be. So in the Taoist Chinese philosophy, it is said that being and non-being arise mutually. It's like the egg and the hen.